Hello everyone, quite portentous topic for today, that is the continuity of classical tradition into medieval civilization. Naturally, as basically everything that we're covering on Schwerpunkt right now, this is not a completely new concept, and probably more people than not, compared to my habitual topics, are acquainted with the concepts for reasons that I will avoid explaining, that are, however, ideological, historiographical at some point, political, cultural in many ways. I'm not sure I'm going to finish the video today, so obviously this can sort of be profitably covered even as an introduction in multiple ones. But there is fundamentally also a set of questions that we should address, I think, when looking at history. It's not merely explaining one topic, say presenting, describing, recounting a specific event or account, like we normally do this. Think about our more evenementally based series that we started here, but even when we talk about tradition in general, and that has obviously an important degree of interpretive, say, dimension that is sort of inherent the type of evidence that we are in possession of, and mostly talking, in fact, from that same past about essentially a spiritual, a metaphysical, even very just like a religious dimension, right? And I noticed when I make videos about this, such as the ones we made a month ago, for example, about the role of Christianity in late antiquity, the connection with these, there are lots of questions that are emerging online nowadays, and it doesn't take much to realize how important the phenomenon is, not much the questions per se, because that's actually where the problems emerge. Today's world is very disoriented, probably more disoriented than it's ever been, primarily because of a sort of neurocognitive collapse, the free fall of personal standards of education, of sort of discipline, of basic sort of mental stability, and much more. So when there is a moment of tabula rasa created by the same lack of knowledge, there are lots of shortcomings. There is also an opportunity to set some fundamentals straight for further discussion, and to proceed from there on, also sort of fixing, modifying, improving this over time. Naturally, on Schwerpunkt, we have arrived at a point where we can afford also to sort of address certain matters, knowing that we already covered them, that there is all a context, background. I always propagandize my playlists, because, of course, I discover, even after yesterday's video, like the other day's video actually, the 3 million views, many people literally come across my content without knowing all my work. I can say who I am, also because I don't say that normally, but I tend to have this impression that my channel, like, unfortunately, this is how YouTube tends to frame us, regardless of sort of content, would be simply designed for quick sort of engagement, algorithmic search, attempt at least, and or some other form of cheap consumption that this channel has never really been about. So my work follows a body doctrine that also sediments in a very original way during the years, because even when we approach topics like tradition, we barely actually see like this as it's normally described as something merely or courageously hinged on some of the specific sort of figures, scholarly figures, that tended to belong to this more occult and or sometimes also hermetic tradition. This is, in fact, not even the point. Occult or hermetic is something else. Here, when we talk about history of religions, so-called, even though religion is not probably the best term, we realize that the information available, especially from classical antiquity and a great part of the Middle Ages, is actually under the sun since ever. Like, it's not a mystery. Almost all sources are publicly accessible. You have a pretty sort of even in the moment in which a civilization forgets about all of this, you have a pretty continuative study and research in all these topics for us to sort of also approach them with the awareness that everybody, if really interested, can simply fall back on the relative sources, primary accounts, and more. So the question we're addressing is, say, how after the dissolution of the Hellenic Roman tradition, so with this classical legacy, synthesizing philosophy, law, civic, religion, and imperial order that shaped the Mediterranean, but also the rest of the world for centuries. We're sticking mostly to the West, but as you know, we explained how truly ecumenic tradition is, and we will expand in fact also on other continents even today, through also, however, more familiar sources like Plato, Aristotle made a video about slavery last month, actually, based on them. Chi-Rho, that we found simply commenting on the tonically superstitious absurdities of in fact, the most telluric aspects of Etruscan religion, right? For telling you that Chi-Rho is not just like some abstract sort of philosopher, writer, orator, etc. He's something much more than that, even if you know of his public life in particular. But he's the guy who would literally tell us that Caesar had a semi-divine aura, right? And that the Fortuna Caesaris was truly sort of a deity on its own. And we covered this in so many also Clausewitzian themed topics because it dramatically matches in the fact, classical origin of Fortuna with the gamble pertaining to the military, to the second person of the Clausewitzian Trinity. That is, this incidentally was what I discovered from multiple years now, perfectly overlapping, in fact, with the Catholic Trinitarian concept. Obviously, as Catholic, we understand as also pre-Christian, and that Romans fully had themselves, and that can be easily extrapolated from the so-called Indo-European tripartite order that did actually exist as a theological principle, regardless of how radical skepticists would like to tell you. But here it overlaps. Yeah, because it existed. In earthly terms, everything overlaps. Actually, this is supposed to be holistic, so you can find different things like, I don't know, monks and knights at the same time. Yeah, this does not invalidate the Trinitarian principle or older Indo-European interpretation. But this is a completely different topic. If anything, I've never really covered that. But I'm really astonished by the superficiality sometimes with which even the works like great scholars like Dumézil are approached, like mistaking his sort of rejection of certain aspects of his theory regarding the Indo-European tripartite order would have equated to some complete absence of the same. Like we are arrived to, even including in his work, in what was in fact able to affirm later, we have arrived to this level of intellectual shallowness. We also looked at the Dorian roots of the Spartan or the Athenian polis. As you know, the same Dorian migration has been historiographically attacked, mostly and unsurprisingly in a very specific time in history, after which, we're talking the 60s, the 70s, after which, also unsurprisingly, instead the idea has been somehow reacquired. It's so easy to understand the bias of historiography. For the obvious historical and cultural temper of the various generations illustrated. We talked about Romanity, we talked about legions. So we know essentially how deeply metaphysical the entire concept of the empire, right, that here brings us back to the Middle Ages in its straight continuity from Roman times in this sense, and we could observe this also for other civilizations. But as you know, on Schwerpunkt, we also often deal with the sort of the alleged concept that fundamentally Romanity would just live within the Byzantine Empire, and whatever happened in the West would have allegedly not been, in fact, anything but a bad copy or incoherent or incompetent even, and not properly a Roman Empire nobody explains in that context also how Rome was still considered the sacred city and center of the world. But let's skip that for a moment, because we will come back on this quite prepotently. But it's important to set a bit the premises, because especially the recent subscribers may have truly never heard of this, and or mostly the fact that I covered all these topics for hundreds of hours at this point. They are all freely publicly available. So in all of this, we can't unsee, obviously, what happened between antiquity and the Middle Ages, in particular between the peak of classical civilization and the one of the medieval one, right? Where the concept of empire, of universal authorities, of Catholic traditional knowledge was radically revived and unequivocally sort of springing out of a continuous tradition, in fact, that had been alive pretty much all across the board, from the papal monarchy to the chanson de geste to the idea of sacred royalty to the empire itself, and that cannot, in that sense, also be denied. Like, we must make, I would say, as a Schwerpunkt, we made lots of videos about the Renovatio Imperii, but there is this part between the so-called end of the western, at least half of the Roman Empire, that, and in fact, Charlemagne and or Otto I, as, let's say, as a missing point. Like, say, if we have to draw this link, also, what can we know about those cultures that were sort of less explicit about this, but that, if you actually scratch beneath the surface, were quite openly aware about the continuity of Romanity and of the empire, and they actually did everything as possible to be properly recognized in the wake, or by properly the same, at a certain point in history. If you're interested in this, I made lots of videos about Clovis. We're probably going to make other videos on the Merovingians that are, in this sense, deeply underrated in many ways regarding this topic. The in-between is, however, something obscure. Like, the idea of the Dark Ages were how wrong, especially when applied to sort of a broader concept of medieval history, is obviously revealing just like the level of illiteracy of a person. And it can be applied only for sort of the lack of documentary intensity, so to say, compared to previous and later periods. Of course, this was a simpler society, it had shrunk, etc., but even there, you realize that the lack of specific documentation does not, say, directly correspond in scale to the actual complexity of a society, and also what does actually that society think, which, when it comes to this, especially lay voice of interpretation of the imperial Catholic tradition, we are in fact less aware of, due to the fact that they normally didn't write, they fought, right? There were obviously literate warriors at some point, and that's also where the interesting things emerge, but technically we know more from the Church of Rome, from sort of the clergy, but not only. It depends on really what sources you're seeking. Like, I don't know if you've ever searched for the concept of empire in a Lombard capitulary when sort of studying the local questions of episcopal territorial disputes and so on. So there is actually much to learn, and, say, getting into the depths of medieval history helps a lot, as much as also being able to reason in more, not abstract, but theoretical terms, when you have to zoom out and explain what was going on, even when you can't look at everything at the microscope, so to say. And talking about the quote-unquote end of antiquity, I would say also for antiquity, quote-unquote, because these are relatively conventional terms and obviously based on a later understanding of history, mostly coming from the later Middle Ages, and or at least never underestimate how deeply aware the medievals throughout all, in fact, their millennium were about the importance of Romanity, for example. Let's leave aside also the obvious Christian roots, the fact that Constantine was a crucial figure and a model for all the other great emperors that, however, were truly seen as Roman at a point and walking in his footsteps, and how much of sort of ancient knowledge, generally speaking, was there just under their eyes, and they were aware of what had civilizationally happened. You would be surprised there by how not just reverent but original the medievals were in explaining how things had come about, in the sense how self-aware. If you read, I don't know, about the opening of certain medieval chronicles of how they start from creation conventionally to eventually end up talking mostly about their own local community. Well, how truly universally contextual, I mean, here from a chronological point of view, it's self-explanatory. This this perspective really was in relation with the older empire in Rome. And interestingly enough, this affects all fields of spiritual endeavor, in the sense that even when you look at the pauperistic evangelical movements, or even in the moment in which they were battling against the current papacy and so on, none of them actually discredited the concept that there had to be a universal authority, nor that Rome was the center of the same. When you look at what Rome was able to do during the early Middle Ages with an empire was allegedly over in the West, but where you had from Rome properly the popes coordinating the evangelization of Europe with the support of the local rulers, and pretty detailed instructions sent to properly these frontiers, even beyond the ones of the Roman Empire, to properly administrate ecclesiastical matters, administration, theological issues, and so on. He realized that there was some deeper and cohesive awareness of the unity of the empire and of the great universal tradition in God, right? I don't know if you have ever thought about this in overlap, when you have still people debating this stuff online regarding religion, like the evangelization of yours. That normally these topics are confined just to what happened to the poor pagans, or how, from the other side, how good Christianity was, depending on how you think about this. It hardly is, the whole thing is hardly reconnected with the parallel existence of an imperial power, and what this meant for those who properly held power itself, that ruled in this same Christian land and beyond. You have a great accessibility in this sense to these ideas through the early church fathers that were witnessing to the decline of secular rule, and who intellectually, philosophically, were deeply part of that classical culture, not even soaked in, properly sort of constitutive, protagonistic members of that world, scientifically, morally, drawing on Platonic and Stoic ideas such as the logos concept and natural law ethics to articulate Christian theology. We talked recently about sort of the various implications, even in the European languages, properly the concept of the word. What is the word, right? Aside from the respective etymologies, because there is all a function there expressing the meaning of divine utterance, but what is, aside even from the differences between the two parts of the Mediterranean, the value of terms like logos in Hellenic or verbum in Latin? There are sort of astronomic, metaphysical meanings attached to this that are truly astronomic, if not properly astrological, in those concepts. We will talk about more the early church fathers here. We don't have to digress specifically, but when you look at the backgrounds of people like Augustine, for example, you realize they had been a Manichaean and had thus been captured by the most pernicious dualism that still affects sort of the world in its fringes and its lesser sort of elements and subnormalities in this sense, and that in fact, is won and defeated by civilization, or a Saint Ambrose of Milan that came from Trier, that was at the center of, in fact, like the deepest higher spheres of Roman government, administration, knew how to handle as a spiritual force the same secular one with Theodosius and the issues with the Goths, the Arian Goths, by the way, in videos that we already saw. And you understand that cooperation that is instaurated at this point between the church and the empire after the de facto, in fact, separate sort of split of these two functions from a unitary, originally singular Christian ruler, yet still, as we will see today, in a still hierarchically recognized sense, are probably at the most, one of the deepest roots of our world. And our modern world, doesn't matter how sort of beyond this has gone also compared to tradition, and in deep continuity. And this is often also misunderstood, because we often say that when Christianity arrived, it basically changed page. This is true in sort of being accurate regarding the understanding of the condition of mankind starting from the Common Era, but not in the sense that, in fact, this was simply an abstract or alien religion or outlook on the world. It actually responded to the same problems that for millennia, and that in this sense, according to tradition starting since the fall, had affected mankind, right? If not humanity at this point, considering the spiraling down, the degenerative decline of the world, that had necessarily brought to effect to this absence of single rulers who could single-handedly manage both the warrior and the priestly function, right? Christianity, in this sense, had a profound role that we partially expounded in other videos of this, seizing the letter of dogma through the living force of form, and thereby cementing the foundations of the new Romano-Germanic Europe, right? There is a normative value of Christianity that, in its ecclesiastical meaning, was meant to correctly orient, vehiculate the predisposition, so to say, the acquisition, the reception of the Holy Ghost, so it's properly in its messenger and therefore apostolic meaning. That is essentially how the imperium would descend with its golden wings on the world, and in this sense, through the media of the same Holy Ghost, namely the emperors, right? And so having a check and balance order between the two universal powers, where the emperors were in charge of earthly, namely temporal affairs, whereas the church had to be ideally in charge merely of the spiritual ones. And a great misunderstanding that normally emerges from this, that at some point the medievals tried to institutionally fix or stabilize. If you watch my videos on, my video actually made only one, on the Sutri meeting between the Pope and Henry V. We are at the beginning of the 12th century. This is before Worms, that would occur just a decade later. Like, the idea that had to be a fundamentally utopistic divide between the temporal and the spiritual dimension was attentively, and in this sense, sort of deeply meditated at this point. There couldn't be, however, such a thing like a church with its own patrimony and its own administration, and in this sense also cooperating with the emperor in order to make things work. I mean, there was always, like, even in justice, in any community, a temporal representative and a spiritual representative, which is actually a beautiful idea, like, with something that completely lacks in today's world, where the state is, in different ways, it's how it's considered, like, centralistically considered the sole source of law, or at least maybe people can be in a divine sense, this is especially in common law, but de facto reduced to some sort of abstract, or at least coldly separated governmental, bureaucratic, administrative system that also corresponds to a level of civilizational development and effectiveness, as a matter of fact, but that fundamentally excludes almost completely the parallel existence of a moral, and a properly higher moral authority that is supposed to supervise this. And in part, we get that from normal political sort of support, consensus, right? You can have a state that does things, but then there is a people that must be governed. So we're not properly even governed by states, do not quite exist as we intend. It's just an illusion because they are an earthly reality, whereas obviously the divine source is meant to be the only absolute truth and justice and so on. So there are very beautiful philosophical reflections on this. Before we mentioned St. Augustine, and sort of the Civitate Dei is there for a reason, but there are sort of many more beautiful visions, including, I would like always to remember this, that the fact that the Roman Empire had already sort of affirmed not just a Catholic, but also a monastic concept, in the sense that the city of Rome was properly meant to mirror the imperial elevation towards heaven. And so every Rome had been refounded across the empire as a colony that, as you know, had all the same literal urbanistic elements of the urbs and so on, was meant to contain the sacrality of that world, together with its imperium. Remember this when you study medieval communes, by the way, across the world. A world that, as we've seen in the video about Montjoie Saint-Denis, was dotted by literal sacred hilltops, citadels of God, pretty much everywhere. This is also beyond the Roman Empire, pretty much everywhere. And still, I live close to one of those places that still bear the name of Montjoie, as a matter of fact. And it's the Mount of Jupiter that is called that for a reason. And that, surprise, surprise, you have in the Christian times churches everywhere in the same way. Like, have you ever thought of how wide that is the case? In any case, this is for telling you how radically continuous Catholic tradition is from pre to Christian times, right? Pre-Christian to properly Christian times. And in this sense, appreciating the relevance of Romano-Germanic Europe as a continuity of this system, it's crucial to understand also how the Romano-Germanic rulers in particular would posit themselves toward this, because it was a much more primitive yet relatively original, or actually more effervescent, and in this sense functional, in this sense more than else primitive and effective, so closer to tradition, way to the empire than the one that we see, for example, in Constantinople, where the Sebastocratic concept is preserved. As you know, the emperor in Constantinople is like basically the Pope in Western tradition. So given that this was technically part of the empire, you already understand how different the idea of the ideas between Constantinople and Rome really were. The emperor is the vicar of Christ on earth for the Byzantines, whereas properly this should be the Pope. And this is, as you know, taking on the characteristics of what in the West will be, as we will see today in part, obviously the struggle between Ghibelline and Guelph ideology, with exception that not just the Pope won in particular against the Byzantine Empire, but in this sense won in the sense that there isn't a good or bad element here. The two elements must be together. They're part of a mystical body, hierarchically ordered. And if something goes wrong, so namely the church does not support the empire, so the emperor does not actually receive the Holy Ghost necessary to, as imperium pauper, to maintain his own authority. This is what had happened already with the Roman Empire. Well, he is the first, in this sense, the total responsible for the whole. Because if you really want to be God yourself, as this titling and sort of institutional profile suggests, there's a lot of theology behind this. There is no excuse regarding who does what there. You weren't high enough. And technically the church, and this is true also as far as the emperors sometimes disconfess the popes, not the papacy. Nobody said there shouldn't be an empire. There shouldn't be a church, right? Not even when, Philip IV of France and Boniface VIII in Rome were quarreling against one another. Nobody said, even when the emperor, in the clashes between Ludwig of Bavaria and Pope John the 22nd, they were disconfessing each other. They weren't denying the necessity of the existence of a papacy or an emperor, even if they annulled each other's idea at that point, in a very much declining in this sense beyond ad personam, but that was the limit of their claims in the crisis of tradition in the mid 14th century. In fact, value, but still accepting the existence of these universal powers that in fact would last until, with the papacy until today, right? It would be a very interesting question today. Let's say, who is supposed to be the empire and how and why? And personally, I read modernity in ways that I've never really heard anyone try, because sort of quote-unquote so-called self-styled traditionalists online tend to be some sort of romanticizing figures that just look at the past and think, oh, that's how it should be done, right? If it looks ancient and retro and stylish, whatever, it's tradition, man, and today things are kind of bad, right? They mix their own political tastes with that. There's no coherence in the way all this stuff is normally conceived, because they don't care fundamentally about the metaphysical issue at hand, and the fact that to these people instead it was absolutely central to everything. In this sense, it's interesting to look at the Byzantine Empire as well, because following Constantine, so as you know, the Roman emperor born around 272, who in 312 experienced, according to sort of legend, the vision of the Chi-Rho symbol before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, issued the Edict of Milan in 313, legalizing Christianity across the empire, and convened the First Council of Nicaea in 335 to define core doctrines like the divinity of Christ against Arian challenges, while moving the capital toward the east. A new change, right, on the horizon of mankind was fully consolidating, right? The idea is that we've seen it also in Constantinian senatorial, economic, military policy, that doesn't matter how still alive antiquity or late antiquity we start calling it from this point onwards, and capable, in fact, of attentively reassert properly the Sebastocratic centrality of rulers. This is something that you see even with anti-Christian emperors like Julian down the line, etc. A general exhaustion had struck the system. We are already in the decline. Like, the big change had been properly the empire of Augustus. It was the peak, and so the beginning, consequently, of a descent. The same goes for Christianity, that providentially posited, in fact, as an unavoidable necessity, the birth of Christ under Augustus. In fact, the indicating the inclining and declining parabola of mankind. And so with Christianity standing as sort of, look, I'd show you what you have to do from now on, as the only antidote to be able to save yourself. Remember that Christianity actually is pretty open about theosis, right? Catholicism, as a matter of fact. This is something, for example, that the other Abrahamic religions do not contemplate. This is for telling you how properly one-of-a-kind Christianity is. While Indo-European tradition did absolutely conceive theosis, and in fact, divine incarnation, not as which alone in and of itself, again, the Romans already understood deeply. For example, in their idea of empire, an incarnated regime, right, holding the world and elevating it to the same divinity, that lives in the concept of empire we've seen today. So very deep and important issues that, remember, if you are born in late antiquity, you know who Alexander was, all right? You know who Augustus was. Like some say, like if you look at Daia did not know who Scipio was, allegedly, because there was these sort of ignorant yet sort of military capable commanders that rise during the Tetrarchy after the 3rd century crisis. Yes, there is a decline, in fact. But remember that the mold, right, is that one. Like, people knew at the time how or why the empire was the one that it was and where it had come from, and sort of in a broader both ancestral, primordial sense and eschatological one, the world was to go like. You have this pretty clearly assessed already by, I don't know, Tacitus, that simply puts tell you that the Roman Empire would have ended like all other empires. It was already a pretty clear sense that the traditional scanning of ages, so this prophetic realization that there is a fourth and last age, the age of the wolf, the one that awaits, in fact, the twilight of the gods, and has, in the iron decline of humanity, that this last chance in the dark, like a spark in the darkness for an ultimate change to occur. This is very important also from a theological point of view, because, as you know, even the possibility of a rebooting normally from a theological point of view is always from the darkest of the abyss. So let's not enter eschatological terrain, because in Schwerpunkt we really have to make more videos about this. But it's you can understand how the millenaristic perspective, even the messianic ones, etc., were actually, for example, the term messianic is mostly used to denigrate, say, Christianity and or other religions that actually have this, such as Islam, for example, especially in the Shia tradition. But that fundamentally would say this is just a superstition and or something that would simply make you entrust yourself to some other guy that will come at some point to save you. Whereas, according to the theology of theosis, this is exactly the opposite of actually what Christianity actually says, right? Consider that Islam does not have, as we've seen, incarnation. It's a very complicated matter. There's no theosis. It's a completely different sort of subject kind of mentality. Whereas Christianity openly has Christomimesis as the purpose of every Christian. So in theory, you can actually become God, right? And so regardless of the Protestant sabotage that unfortunately happened as another major collapse in sort of Western civilization, the disasters of the world, not just of Western civilizations, you are actually supposed, according to Catholicism, to save yourself and the world as a consequence, because that's the entire point of it all. You can't do it but through Christ, but that's not something different from somebody that participated to the Mitraic cult in the 3rd century Roman army regarding what Mithras himself had done. So only through him and his esoteric path initiated careers you had to go through. So it's very strange how confused, generally speaking, people are, and or how this is not even lack of knowledge, it's really wanting to simplistically bend certain interpretation in some sort of almost cartoonish caricature of religion for that. Let's be honest, at this point nobody really understands anymore. Like it's over. Like the idea of spirituality at this point, we're truly in the 4th age. It's undeniable that in late antiquity the social-cultural profile is heading towards a further crisis, right? There is a huge debate, as you know, historiographically, as to where we misinterpreted this time. It's, the Mary Beard, I don't think she actually goes even that far. Like the kind of arguments, no, we have to challenge your preconceptions, we have to break the schemes, right? Just for the sake of being contrarian. Like these are literally 1968 kids' generations that they thought that was cool just to tell to the adults it's actually not true, and actually they don't know that what they said was actually not true, and that they should have been listening a little bit more to the elderly there. And so yes, there is an actual decline, there is an actual erosion of the form, right? Not just of the substance of the world at that point, right? There are certain aspects about the Constantinian. Again, obviously you have to be able, like in anything in life, in theology, in politics, to reason through a double thread, right? And in other words, also the doctrine of the two natures. I am a great admirer, for example, of the Constantinian army and also Constantine's achievements and foundations, etc. I challenge the notions that sort of the late Roman army was fundamentally a worse one. There are certain aspects in which it was even superior to the early imperial one, but as a whole, right, we can't help but recognize in a bigger moral, political sense that not just the empire had been sort of destabilized, had been losing territories, had now a tougher time like controlling the frontier, but fundamentally the internal balance was the cause of this, was the increasing social stratification, the tying of ever more individuals to the land. In a defensivistic approach, you didn't need to waste resources because there were less, both in terms of manpower and labor force. You had to be careful in rightly framing, in fact, the question in the right ideological sense, as you were saying before. But the relation between Ambrose of Milan and Theodosius the Great is, an incredibly, it's paradigmatic, right, in relation to the various theological aspects of Christianity, the behavior, the relations, the interactions with the Federati, the barbarian invaders, and so on. So this is definitely a picture that resembles in many ways those more decadent characters that we have also hyper inflated to a degree regarding the establishment of a more of a medieval world, of a feudal society, right? The increasing importance of the gold currency. This also, from a monetary standpoint, is a major aspect, like the hopeless at that point debasement of the silver denarius that was, speaking of more of a middle class vitality from the previous era, that was incarnated by that older idea of the free citizens in arms that had been the same Roman legionnaires that had conquered the world, obviously always sort of led by specific leaders. This is a change you can find also among the barbarians themselves. I mean, Germanic society is much more oligarchic at this point than it was before. And in general, being the relation with the land, right? The idea that you can't quite simply leave your own master milieu, that you're tied to the profession of your parents. There is probably a heavy and necessary at this point judgment about your existential condition, which is all quite well tied in with the Christian realization that yes, the world has somehow failed to an important degree. The temporal and spiritual authorities alike have to be warier of the weakening of humanity, probably from a genetic standpoint and more. And so we have the idea of a bloodless Europe, a bloodless world, estranging itself even from its own nature, what had made the Macedons, the Romans, the great empires of antiquity, the ones that had truly turned the tide in terms of the creepingly declining world, ever more attracted to a Pelasgianly, netherworldly nature of sensualism, of emotionalism, and that now was somehow, with all the various heresies and, in this sense, like sabotage of civilization, gradually bring to further erosion of the empire, especially paradoxically in the East, where we're habituated to think, well, but it kind of lasted the longest. Yes, but it lasted in autocratic forms with some Levantine elements that were properly the ones that would also open the gates to the Arabs, that were identified by the same Christians centuries before. We've seen it in the writings of Hippolytus. That's what always struck me, probably in a prophetic sense, regarding the acephalic, almost anarchic and sort of disorderly administrative profile, say, of the Syrian churches, the ones that, if not all of them naturally, but say those who belong to the fringe, that were not really behaving like we were not in line with the imperial direction, right? When you look at even the Aryan Germans in the West, looking at times like the one of the Tricapitoline Schism, the later iconoclasm, and all those sort of all the other issues that, as you know, had been there with this equilibristic maneuvers to wink at monophysitism, monothelitism, and so on. Like, even the Aryan Germans were normally aligned with the papacy, and they sort of eventually sort of became fully Catholic at that point, and they did not go at all astray from in any theological matter, right? Their Arianism was mostly a political issue. They didn't even have the theological interest or capacity to create schisms in any particular sense, but they were in fact fully integrating, amalgamating with the broader Western Roman, and in this sense, ultimately imperial legacy, right, of Western Europe. Like, again, the Latin-speaking lands were at large much more cohesive than the eastern part of the empire. As you know, was also more composite. It wasn't merely speaking Greek as such. There were lots of other elements within the same. But in this sense, we're really witness to a profound crisis. It can't be merely, merely or superficial, or secularly political or social, or even worse, economic. Where this must be interpreted in a deeply moral, traditional, and metaphysical sense, right? It's as if the empire crystallized for a time, especially at least from an institutional point of view, in an oriental mirage of ascetic withdrawal and otherworldly focus, in which essentially even participation to the imperial effort was considered in vain, right? And that's why, in fact, certain communities that had been heretical detach themselves from the empire in the East, or do not properly contribute enough to the general effort. There are always elements interspersed that actually do that. Like, it's impossible to say on a territorial basis. Obviously, it was happening at every sort of political, military, and social level. There was a struggle between these cultures. Hell, there were even some Arabs that fought till the last for Rome against the rising tide of Islam. So you want to appreciate those figures. Well, we shall talk about that for that matter. And so it's also difficult not to see how, first of all, admittedly more sheltered Western Europe really was. Like, if you look at the role of Constantinople in mitigating all the tidal movements, like of peoples around the Pontic area, like stemming Sasanian infiltrations, and like it had like a major role in halting the avalanche of peoples reversing themselves against and crashing themselves against the Theodosian walls, right, on the Bosphorus. We know how portentous Byzantine civilization was, right? We are to resume actually some videos about this pretty soon. We don't have to recount all the various vicissitudes that the empire went through, but also we have abundantly studied its own characteristics. The fact that this crystallization in the institutions was actually helpful to properly maintain certain fundamentals unaltered, to withstand those tidal waves in major crises, losing half of the empire extension with the early Islamic invasions, but also being able, in fact, to recover a substantial part of the same at a point, reactivating capacity. It was definitely something about the Hellenic legacy that went on in a deep sense, also in the Roman West, that now was indestructible in the Byzantine identity of Constantinople. But what we're talking about today, finally, is the topic we already addressed more than once, but we never fully reinvigorated as it really deserves to be, namely the Germanic infusion of tribes like the Franks under leaders such as Clovis, converted to Catholicism straight from pre-Christian, from Odinism. Let's not say paganism, because that's another thing. In 490, if you don't know the difference, well, welcome to Schwerpunkt, by the way. In 496, you have the Visigoths, who settled in Spain and southern Gaul after sacking Rome in 410, and the Longobards, who established a kingdom in northern Italy from 568, bringing robust warrior customs, personal loyalty bonds through oaths of fealty, and assemblies like the thing for decision-making into the former Western Roman territory. This mechanism, you would say, well, what's about that, right? After all, tribal cultures fundamentally function like that, right? Yes, but not all tribal cultures are the same, nor they are all capable of reacting to civilization in the same ways. In fact, there is this sort of mentality that is sort of quite rampant, especially on the current right, that sees sort of the most exasperated, primitivistic tribalism as some kind of protagonist in here. When we look at the most successful peoples like the Goths, here I also didn't mention the Vandals, the Ostrogoths, but this was just for sake of example. Like, you realize that admittedly, it is true that the most Romanized Germans ended up fairly badly, right? It is true that the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, constitute the most initially splendid or at least Romanly continuous domains in southern Europe that we reckon. But they're both obliterated, right? The Ostrogoths from the same Byzantines, the Visigoths by the Arabs later on. And it is especially the Franks and the Longobards. We can add obviously to the account that the Anglo-Saxons that specifically entering in Western Roman lands will characterize the nature of our Europe in ways that are departing and or at least find themselves in a position where they can properly reorganize the moral hierarchy of these lands. This is not even to say to depart from the Roman model from late antiquity, because you have all kind of variations here. It's obvious that Longobard Italy, contrary to also what some people think, was radically and traumatically Roman in character. De facto, like by far the greatest urban continuity, wealth per capita, it's something utterly insane. And it's actually a major topic that nobody seems to realize, how also civilly advanced, how literate, how urbanized, how properly light years ahead compared to the Franks, for example. This was by the time of Charlemagne. From a civil point of view, the Franks were better at war. Naturally, if you talk about the Anglo-Saxons, it took a while for them to sort of achieve some greater unity and capacity of sort of power projection. They eventually were fundamentally reinvaded by the Danes, by eventually the Normans. So it's something slightly more complicated, but the greatest model, the one that in fact is going to inform all of these countries, because Italy and Britain are at the end of the day obliterated by the Franks at some point, sooner or later, at least in terms of this sort of ethnic Germanic leadership, or at least what had become by that point, depending on what you're looking at, obviously, with the recreation actually of the Roman Empire, with the coronation of Charlemagne on Christmas Eve of 800 AD in St. Peter's Basilica, right? And I will not here, obviously, I'm bringing so much on the table, so I don't want to confuse you, right? Let's stick to the migration here, but let's try to realize that, for example, the more, in this sense, quote-unquote, authentically Germanic Norse sort of character survived in peoples that were fundamentally not living particularly well, were not particularly powerful, they weren't particularly developed, they weren't particularly rich. Most of them are actually either conquered by Frankish civilization and or evangelized, and largely doing so by themselves under the guidance of Franco-Roman civilization. And that, in fact, the idea of an empire ending in the West is somehow very debatable on the grounds of the congregational and, in this sense, agglutinating capacity that post-Roman Latin Germanic civilization was able to accomplish. It's not to say that other elements, also including the Slavs, did not contribute to this. That would be wrong and deeply misleading. There are so many different influences in this, and there is also a continuity, for that matter, with links with Constantinople, in different ways, from direct context to models of rule. And that should make you think, because the fact that in 10th century Britain, some English at that point, rather than Anglo-Saxon kings, would style themselves as basileii, not imperatores even. It's something that, in the mid of the age, if not properly Dark Ages, but say in the High Middle Age, from the opposite side of Europe, should really make you think a bit. And naturally, we know why these things kind of happened. We know why the imperial title was bestowed, for example, also in Spain, that has its own, during the Reconquista, imperial tradition. The Visigoths, by the way, had debatedly weakened their own system due to not just the original issues of not passing straight from Aldonism to Catholicism, even though Aldonism was a Catholic tradition as such, and but in any case, scaling up to properly a Catholic Christian politics and ecclesiastical administration, and followed Arianism for a while. Rather the fact that it had seemingly imitated Constantinople, right? Their model was much more Byzantine than, say, the one of the closer to the Byzantines, Longobards, in many ways. In fact, there was something, and so for saying that the Visigothic kingdom would somehow sclerotize, right, would be incapable in all its size to withstand the Islamic invasions, right? Differently from the Franks and the Longobards, were sort of more sheltered in a sense, but were also definitely not spotted as the weak element of Europe, and were actually, in fact, Gaul and Italy sort of propel, as they had always been doing, telling the truth, at least since late antiquity, the eventual booming of Western civilization in the following centuries. And all this with a properly Franco-Roman, in a sense, imperial papal universal unity that is impossible to miss as a general actor, and actually a dominating, overarching actor, even over the Byzantine Empire will be fundamentally taken over by the Crusaders down the line, right? So when we look at the injection of these Germanic peoples in the West, first of all, we know that they were mostly taken over as a regime, an establishment. There weren't actually many, right? They were a staunch minority amidst the millions that lived in all these major post-Roman Western chunks, right? But they stiffen especially the hierarchical sense, that the idea of sacred royalty in a primarily sort of involved sense, like even in a time in which, as we've seen, they would become reverent of the church and they would accept its support. They still had a pretty strong idea. They would maintain it for a very long time, probably up to the later Middle Ages, a sense of the sacrality of kingship as a sort of imperial dominance over the church, as the hierarchical norm really was. Remember what we said before: if there is a shortcoming, you lose that kind of primacy, and or at least you're not, as this mostly happens during the medieval millennium, you're not going to fully assert yourself over the church, right, due to your own sins as well. And so there's not even an ecclesiastical takeover for that matter. This is a motive that recurs in especially traditionalist historiography, the idea between the idea of the hero / king / warrior that manages to crush the rebellion of the sort of more insidious and chtonically oriented priest that maintains this more feminine principle. This is an exaggeration if you look at what the actual, in fact, overlapping of symbolism and identities, etc. Christ is a man, like, in case you didn't notice. Like, there isn't a re-elevation of the great matter, especially when you realize that also the Virgin, the Theotokos, is the transfigured Virgin. It has nothing to envy to Artemis or Athena or the winged glory like of Nika, Victoria, and so on. So that there is actually a radical difference between. It already existed in Roman times, or in any other Indo-European culture for that matter. So be extremely careful not to fall into this sort of simplistic childlike dichotomies if you don't understand properly the theological underpinning of these metaphysical concepts. In any case, there is a stark comparison that we also answer in some Q&A, and especially criticizing the very recent historical notion that belongs a bit to what the shock moral effect that sort of certain scholars would like to provide to others, that if anything just tells it how they are actually ignorant about how some people, very few people unfortunately, but still are much more aware than them about. And it is the comparison between the West and what would happen to the Byzantine world, right? What was the rest in the sense of the Roman orb? Hadn't the orb remained there, still controlled, as we've seen before, by also some spiritually Roman leaders, right? Cooperating with the Church of Rome and maintaining also an imperial delegation, many occasions from Constantinople. Clovis had the Vicariate of the Gauls. There was all an obvious brokering in the negotiation revolving around the Roman imperial titles bestowed from Constantinople at a point, but eventually by the papacy as well. That is the big step forward. But what happened to the Byzantine part was absorbed by Islam through the rapid 7th, 8th century conquests that, in fact, as we were hinting at before, swept from Arabia across North Africa into Spain under the Umayyad Caliphate, creating al-Andalus, with Constantinople slowly withering as the eastern part of the empire focused on survival against multiple fronts, including Persian, Arab, Slavic, and later Turkic pressures, maintaining a more bureaucratic and Hellenistic character. It's impossible in this sense not to notice how in the West a new religious vision was taking shape. This opens, in fact, in the aftermath of the dissolution of the western half of the Roman Empire as an administrative district, so to say. It doesn't matter how expansive this territory was, from Britain to Mauritania, from Lower Germany to Libya, is the sort of spiritual temper of the time. How would these people living in Western Europe realize the capacity of rising again amidst especially all the turbulent events that were happening in the East? You would think, well, okay, what concerned Constantinople did not really directly concern them up to a point. On the contrary, probably gave them some edge because the Byzantines had to spend enormous resources to withstand these blows. And this is accurate up to a certain point, not just because at some point there are the second invasions. I talked about them multiple occasions. We have the same Islamic threat coming from the southern shores of the Mediterranean. You have actually Spain and even parts of Gaul and Sicily controlled, in southern Italy controlled by the Saracens at a point. You have the, however, main continental part of this Gallic, British, and Italic, and gradually extend the German world, really creating something. Even before, obviously, the Islamic invasions, it would, after all, happen relatively soon. If you especially consider how long antiquity had been continuing, in fact, in the Mediterranean, well after 476. And in this context, the soul as principle, deciding all that the body would execute in every rational being according to patristic and scholastic anthropology, required those who claimed authority only over the social body to subordinate themselves to the church, which held the exclusive right over souls and their direction through sacraments, confession, and excommunication. This is particularly relevant because it brings us, once again, for each of these statements, I should make probably 20 videos, right? So you will forgive me if these videos here are pretty long and stopping to comment at every insight. But it's definitely correct, right? There had been an ecclesiastical dimension, right? What will emerge properly as a temporal power eventually, that is the Patrimonium Sancti Petri, and the patrimonium actually of any other church, right, in the West, a church that, we want to stress, had been ecumenic, all right? At Nicaea, like, you have people coming in from outside the Roman Empire at a point, or at least during the various ecumenic councils. You will have, in fact, a church that travalicates the borders, like the boundaries of different polities and peoples and tongues and sort of stretches of sea, etc. Right? You have Christians participating to ecumenic councils in Constantinople, even coming from lands ruled over by the Muslims at some point. So it's something that transcends indeed the earthly dimension by definition, right? The spiritual power here entails that the church is not just God's in this sense, but as such sets some standard that not even the greatest earthly power can simply challenge, because it is the only vehicle of divinity itself, or at least the emperor is not outside of the church. Nobody is actually outside of the church, right? On the reasons of how Christianity was universally accepted in this world, and how, in fact, very scarce resistance at any theological level could even arise from the same. So that actually the evangelization of Europe is something much smoother, notoriously, from terms of mental cadres, right? There wasn't this wrestling with, some kind of paganism, heathenism. Like there was no chance that ideology stood, because it was just like a particular declension in great part of at the elite level, that is the same elite that sort of Christianized the quickest. So the Vaudanists were, in that sense, also maintaining part of that same beliefs as perfectly coherent with the imperial Catholic tradition. As a matter of fact, as we've seen this in many also folkloristic sense, like there is a constant superimposition of those ideas. If we look at paganism as such, so the rural chthonic superstitions and certain specific sort of matrifocal elements belong even properly pre-Indo-European Europe, still in the countryside among the pagenses, probably. It's something that the church cares about only up to a certain point, simply because these people have no power. And so actually, even there, the continuity of certain chthonic cults was also completely normal, to the extent that these people eventually turned to be converted to Christianity without even probably abandoning those ideas. As we know very well, many superstitions and practices that were, in any case, in fact, that are inseparable in the hierarchy of values. There must be an Apollonian as much as a Dionysian. There must be a Uranian as much as a chthonic. After all, the purpose of the church and the empire was to transfiguring the world into something totally heavenly. So equally, the emperor could not be outside the church. On the contrary, in spite of the ecclesiastical exclusivity over the spiritual standards and how this had to be set, and you have to understand this especially on the grounds of Rome, and the Church of Rome maintaining the highest spiritual profile at that point over anyone, right? They literally withstood and probably ultimately defeated the autocratic and murderous impulses of the Sebastocratores of the East, right? That at some point even deported popes, wanted to even kill them in a sense that way, and gave order for doing so, etc. Rome elevated itself as a principality. Eventually did not even technically belong to or at least the city of Rome had its own earthly dimension and commune. It belonged to the empire, say, but the Patrimonium Sancti Petri, there are some legal subtleties about this as well, was truly a metaphysical realm. It did not belong to the Holy Roman Empire. It did not belong to anything earthly, for that matter. There were naturally, like many communities that belong to the earthly dimension, but we're talking metaphysics here, not extensional pieces of dirt where humans stand after the fall, right? There are very interesting descriptions even of how, like, the earth at some point had been created, according to some Christian apologists in the first centuries of the empire, exactly to prevent humans to fall to the center, to hell, basically, straight away, right? It was still seen. You see that the positive element about the actual incarnation and sort of world creation after in its sort of fallen essence, or this polluted essence in that regard. But aside from this, the exclusive right over souls and their direction through sacraments, confession, and excommunication holds two important characteristics. The first one is the fact that the church, in this sense, is not positing itself as some sort of alien, allogen element that fundamentally does not have anything to do with other institutions. Everybody's Christian, all right? You have certain countries like, for example, the Italian peninsula that are sort of Christianized practically entirely. Like I can imagine 95% of people being nominally Christian already by, say, the end of the 6th century, right? So there are wide differences in that level of acceptation as well. The church, in this sense, is not just univocally recognized, because other interesting point is that even before the papal monarchy in the 11th century with the Gregorian reforms, it's not like, I don't know, somebody else had come up and said, well, Christianity is no more, let's do something else. Or, Rome, after all, does not have a primate of charity, for example, in honor. Rome was already de facto Germanic from a spiritual standpoint. This is absolutely clear as far as the British Gallic-Italic axis is concerned. Also about the various Germanic, Christian, already Christian Germanic lands. The Visigoths are ambiguous. They treat Toledo as a sort of spiritual center on its own that rivals Rome, but obviously can't quite compare for different reasons. But we also sort of understand this as surely an important manifestation of regionalism in Europe, because again, the Visigothic kingdom was a pretty big and important thing, but also in a time in which there was a lot of sort of inward focus, and definitely like the Iberian Peninsula would historically remain something relatively autonomous, even after it rejected Visigothic right in exchange for the Roman Church support in the Reconquista, also with the Frankish, in fact, participation and so on. In other words, sacraments, confession, excommunication were not really different from what, I don't know, sacrificing to the imperial divinity was back in the day. There were all some formal ritual mechanisms that absolutely worked as a state religion, where there was a certain level of tolerance, because this was just like a big feudal empire with a hierarchy where Rome dominated over every other possible deity, and crushed also the ones that were practically irrelevant. There was witch hunting, people massacred for religion, well before Christianity, in all Catholic empires, like from the Roman one to India, China. This is an actual thing. The so-called illicit cults, as the Romans properly termed that, as opposed to the illicit ones, as a matter of fact. Also, the Christian one had been illicit, but to a degree that still allowed its survival. Basically, the Romans were not so fussy about. Also, nobody really at the time had the means to univocally uniform religious belief, which makes even all the more extraordinary how successful Christianity actually was in this during the early Middle Ages, and eventually for reasons that touch a profound chord of the human fall that had occurred after the same fall of the Roman Empire. And in this sense, nobody could escape sacraments, confession, excommunication, aside from the fact that all of this has its own role and significance and meaning. But this is not just a universal one, but one that objectively holds a massive social cultural value. The idea that, for example, the Holy Ghost proceeds from God through the same imperial authority, we'll see now how, but by supervision of the church, that the boundaries of the precinct of which is in fact the only sacred one, is first of all like already a Roman one. Like the idea that the pomerium was sacred, that in this sense certain particular rites had to be officiated, that Rome had become the world fundamentally, and this entailed the same state religion we were talking about before. The necessity of redemption, that's something that the Romans had overly stressed in their successful world domination, and that deeply lives within the same Latin language used by the Roman Church, and the same necessity to indicate those who had failed, and so to excommunicate those rulers who did not properly abide with the principles of an ecumenic standard, a universal standard, the deep civilizational value inherent a fallen world that shows you that before sort of going out in the world and pretending to have an opinion, you may want to check what civilization is about and realize that probably you have to learn from lots of other people before attempting to sort of create another law on your own. This is actually what heroes and gods and God himself, according to the various pathways that we've seen here, had been about. After all, the same Christ had established a new law, right? So even in there, the Christian continuity in the realization that there is a divine law that supersedes any earthly one is not a sort of dismissal of an imperial, for example, regimen of justice, right? It must be exercised by properly harmonizing with God, and therefore obtaining the imperium and using it also to pacify the world and elevate it. You have literally like the incentive, and as we were saying before with theosis and Christomimesis, for the emperors from the side of the church to reach those standards and models. Right? The church wasn't setting some arbitrary standards that depended on whichever they had in mind. If you study also canon law, and you realize how it had been forming through the various centuries of council collections, later the various collections of canon laws, decretals. We made lots of videos about this. Like, they are deeply like old medieval law, telling the truth, like differently from some modern degeneration, like some incredibly not just specific and problem-solving oriented, but effective answers to a world where ultimately, this was the point, a sole empire had to be reestablished. When you study early high medieval society, what do you think law, have you ever studied medieval law from the actual source? What do you think it's all about? It's about reconstituting order. Like an Aurelian that reconstitutes the world after his collapse. It's the same identical mentality that leads into the necessity of a Lord of Justice. That is inherently a divine concept. So the notion that the church in this sense was simply opposite or somehow coexisting at a merely secular level with the empire, that there wasn't, since, by the way, the legalization of Christianity, a full integration of various different functions between the church and sort of an imperial rule and so on, is blind, all right? In this sense, the church posits itself as a guarantor that emperors go in the right direction. And they do so, you would say, but in this sense, is it continuistic in nature? How does this doctrine work? This metaphysically does not make sense as an observation, because the idea is that exactly because there isn't any other law but the one of God, if as an emperor you fail in any way, for any issue that you may have also with the church, which at this point largely wasn't happening because the investiture controversy is something that develops later. It was actually even positive for Western civilization, and this is exactly the point. The default is yours. There is something defective in your rule, because any rule instantiates itself immediately in the moment in which it's just. There isn't, but that guy sabotaged. It's your responsibility. This is what the entire world horizon revolves around. It's simply realizing what personal responsibility means, because what happens now is now forever. And is like this forever, at least. It's part of a flow that is modified by the same individual actions, but it will last forever. It won't be simply erased and cleansed. Just like you can't simply cleanse the original sin, or at least literally what you have accumulated in your own genes from the sin of all your predecessors, which is, in this sense, like bringing about the idea that Christianity brought the idea of the blood guilt from an allegedly, specifically Semitic background. It's true that Semitic religions had, as we've seen, Christianity radically differs. It literally tells that you can become God by yourself as a human, as a man at that point, which is not to be found outside of Indo-European religions, other parts of sort of traditional thinking. But we'll see this better in another video. The blood guilt is inherent to the fact that you are fallen. Right? It's not some sort of stigma sort of stamped over you that somebody else has posited is an illusion. You literally, all the sins, all what has your ancestors haven't paid for weighs on you, and it's the reason why you're actively mortal, because you actively fear, and that's the only cause of your mortality. And this actually shows you how there isn't such a thing like a blood guilt, in the sense that you have to be able to transcend blood guilt, but not because it does not exist. The entire problem of why the lower nature exists is that you're actively maintaining it, as opposed to come back to the one, right? So in that sense, any failure is exclusively your fault. It's your fault and everybody's fault at the same time. We're so deeply immersed in this sort of secularistic mentality that today, if you say whose fault is for something, and say, I don't know, I ran you over with a car and kill you, it's my fault because I've done it. But this is man's law, right? It's supposed to fix things in a way or not, and it's apparently just able to put patches on things, and sometimes it does do the right thing sometimes. But metaphysically, in fact, in this sense, the fault for you being run over by a car is also entirely yours, because where do you draw the line between sort of being more careful and, in this sense, valuing your life, and therefore going out there? There's a level of recklessness that you obviously, in practical temporal terms, we have to accept, and that in this sense we have somehow normalized. But if this actually brings to our death, it's like, where are our max powers? Why couldn't we sort of prevent this? Where does our potential stop, if it stops to begin with, before it arrives to God, right? So this is how they thought the whole thing to work at the time. And it's only in post-traditional times that lesser people were told it's somebody else's fault and you shouldn't worry about it. And you wonder why, the world is fundamentally about lesser people. Now, the Church at some point came to contest doctrines of natural and divine derivation of kingship, only to the extent in which, like, the standards of the office were properly not met, right? There was a level of, as you know, debate regarding where the imperial prerogative started and the papal ones at the end of the day ended. Right, this was actually inherent the church in general, even before the papal monarchy and the more sort of intense phase of the investiture controversy, right? That in fact shows us already a shared power. Like, the investiture controversy was about the investiture of a single person from both powers, and about the primacy of the same, and in which regions, and which in that sense also temporal and spiritual consequences alike. We made lots of videos on it. But in this sense, there was a debate over which universal authority ultimately held the utmost control. Because if you are, this may be a relativistic concept, because obviously if each authority has its own function, its own special, so to say, its own specific purpose, there should be at least, a sectorialization of competences. But when we look at temporal and spiritual, this, as you know, reflects in between the two, right? There are authorities, powers, men at the end of the day, as popes and emperors, that are bridging the gap between God and men anyway, each in their own account. And so the point was being definitive regarding who held properly the moral standard, whether moral standards were made by actual conquest, like in the imperial case. And so if in that case the rule of the sovereign was truly divine or not. And as we explained, indeed, he who failed to reconstitute the Roman Empire had inherently something wrong in it. As much as the papacy, you can see it from the other side, but not being able to fully maintain order in the church and solve properly the sin of men, was indeed operating a shortcoming. And so there could be all the sort of accusations, counter-accusations regarding the person in the office as opposed to the office, right? That's why it never became a heresy, even down the line, to think that there was a natural divine derivation of kingship, right? There was, on the contrary, on a much higher level and philosophical one, and not even this was ever, in fact, stigmatized per se, if not in a broader rhetorical and sort of warning direction, like the idea of being able to prevaricate through human pride, right? And this is what was mostly contested to emperors, which was the problem since, in fact, the decline of the empire is to say, if we couldn't keep all the empire together, if we lost territories, if there are some Christians under the infidels, if in this sense the holy places are usurped, if you as an emperor are not able to actually control the entire Christendom, the question is, how can you think that your rule is actually divine and not see that you're still imperfect, you're still human, you're still mortal? So you can't simply claim that, right? If not aspirationally. But at the same time, it was always a genuine sort of attitude in the church, not just, this is very underrated, to actually create peace among Christians. But if you look in international, diplomatic, legal, administrative sense, in medieval Europe, it was actually constant, right? We remember the church only for the Crusades, which were also actually perfectly fine. The repression of heretics, the fact that the church did absolutely side with one or side or another in the context between Christians, but always aiming at fundamentally stabilizing also specific national realities in this still hierarchy of a church and an empire had to rule over it. But literally supporting the emperor against the same pushing him for the crusade, against, say, I don't know, the Mongols, bringing peace, justice, and recognizing him. I mean, emperors existed formally, institutionally, because the Pope crowned them, right? And this, interestingly enough, was always accepted in Latin Germanic Europe, even in the peaks of Ghibellinism, sort of intolerance of papal interference, right? And equally, there was a genuine commitment from the imperial side to actually boost the church, to boost the same level of spiritual quality that could, in fact, support an imperial rule in a papal context, in the papal curia. This all is, the sense, sort of relative. The fact that the church would be more, for example, doctrinally explicit or politically active, in particular, in viewing secular rulers as subject to spiritual oversight, is something that shouldn't, in this sense, outweigh the fact that the emperors did have their own mentality as well. It's a matter of debate, the extent by which it is, because indeed, temporal, let's say, properly lay law existed in ways that disciplined or even developed in parallel properly with the relation with the church. When you study, I've seen this often, the birth of universities. This is the same period of the Decretum Gratiani. This is the same time of the investiture controversy. This is actually also the same time of the booming of Europe. As a Western empire, or at least a set of powers that somehow recognize both papacy and empire as universal authorities. So, seeing in the prince a layman equal to all others before God and the church does not mean that the prince could not properly hold the highest power possible. Like, the church lent itself multiple times to this kind of recognition of imperial divinity, right? If he had come to so close for that, at some point the papacy itself kneeled in front of the emperor, not out of force, but out of recognition. This happened during the Carolingian era, for that matter, out of recognition of the imperial dignity as such. So you can be, quote unquote, equal in front of God in the sense that God is the absolute. So you are equal in potential in front of God. Then when this potential becomes manifest, and so in action, and so it's ever more divine, You are ever more divine as a consequence. At that point, the church actually recognized this standing. Otherwise, they would have never elected an emperor with their own ends, right? And they would have, in this sense, also not properly established the figure of an emperor in the West. If the narrative is the papacy wanted just to get rid of empires, regardless of its decentralized position between Constantinople and sort of the Transalpine world, like there is always a recognition, a preference, in a proper establishment. Had it been for the Pope, right, it's debatable what kind of sort of imperial and especially Roman recognition Transalpine rulers could have had. Probably they would have been able to push it anyway, because again, in metaphysical terms, if this was the understanding, they would have been recognized as sacred rulers to the extent by the extent of their imperial power. But here we're talking about real history. In real history was the papacy who backed this, that gave this vital lymph, that potently affirmed the imperial legitimacy of Germanic rulers. In this actually bigger Latin Germanic axis and war, it was much more familiar than we think normally. Again, Charlemagne was not the first ruler to decide that there was a connection with Rome, or that he could also become an emperor. Like the papal relations with, say, Clovis already were pretty well established, for not talking about the evangelization of the Anglo-Saxons. The relations, in any case, that Rome maintained with Constantinople up pretty late in time, in the 12th century, in terms of, okay, you are the actual eastern half, and these guys are the western half of the empire. This is very explicit, well explicitated in medieval sources, all right, as two arms of the church, like the two halves, right? They were considered like that because there was obviously an ecumenic ideology underpinning that, regardless of convenience, right? They would have not used it otherwise. And you understand how much this sense continuity, if anything, models there was with antiquity. And you can't basically say that these authorities did not exist, were not there, or were invented or made up. There was not actually a functional rule, where this is definitely not the case, right? At some point, the idea that the emperor is an officer instituted according to natural right who must receive from ecclesiastical hierarchies what is necessary, lest his government becomes a civitas diaboli, that is a demonic city opposed to the city of God, is thus not obscuring the fact that the emperor holds imperial power himself, and that the church is fully aware of his might, if anything, because at some point it had also to withstand it. And the church had been created historically exactly to show that if you wander, like walking around Europe and looking at our beautiful cathedrals and the power of the church and the papacy, you realize that what those buildings, quote unquote, and those actual metaphysical architectures mean is the presence of a power so great that nobody on earth can presume, by being merely on earth, to be able to tread on, right, to infringe upon. This is the point. It's an absolute shout, cry of liberty proper, that resonates across the entire world. It's a major warning saying, look at what happened to the Roman Empire. If you want to be even a minimal part of what the Roman Empire had to be, you better get your act together, right? And you start behaving in a mature, authoritative, right, effective way. You have to prove to be divine. And so this is the greatest of enterprises. This can't be any human standard to measure this. And as the church, we establish it. If you don't like it, try get us, if you can. And most of the attitude was, in this sense, also competitive, polemical, conflictual, but it was also supportive, complementary, and in this sense, truly cooperative. Because the purpose was unique. There wasn't another purpose. There wasn't such a thing like an empire that wanted to establish itself somewhere, and the papacy wanted to establish itself somewhere else. and they accidentally found each other in the same way. It was the same world that functioned with these dual natural authority, so that even natural law itself made emperors' powers with bestowal again of the Holy Ghost in the form of imperium for their merit that could not be denied. Right? Popes could not deny that power existed. This is the difference between us and them. Right? Today, for us, it's like, people can literally make up how wars go, not understanding anything of that, and claiming that a power is not a power, does not have power, that in still reality being the one that it is. In medieval times, people realized which powers were actual powers and why, especially. And while there were obscure forces trying to undermine this thing, this definitely did not pertain to either the empire or the church. Actually, these were the two lighthouses, the sun and the moon, as they were called. In any case, theocratic rule. However, you want to sort of attribute the theocratic power to in measure to either of the two. They both had it, and they were in that sense meant to be one with a sole purpose, and they really were. All right. So the idea that the church, for example, was a theocratic meridional turn, reaching its logical conclusion in Boniface VIII, Pope from 1294 to 1303, a canon lawyer, who clashed with King Philip IV of France over taxation and jurisdiction, issuing the 1302 bull Unam Sanctam, asserting that submission to the Roman pontiff was necessary for salvation, and famously declared supreme authority by wearing imperial regalia in ceremonies, did not really mean any degradation of the actual metaphysical power of the empire, right? While Boniface did not hesitate to ascend to the throne of Constantine with sword, crown, and scepter to declare himself Caesar and emperor, literally, attributing both evangelical swords to the priest and regarding the empire merely as a beneficium conferred by the Pope, entailing the same vassalage and obedience that a feudatory owes to his investiture. We're also talking about the peak of papal power in absolute terms. We're talking about an actual, a pope that had armies and could control Europe in many ways and had a great ascendancy. In any case, lost against Philip IV anyway. So if any attempt was there in meddle the waters, actually, we can easily see a continuity between the idea of an emperor that is always has a great deference towards the church itself, that even when this asks essentially for recognition of power in exchange for the standard of imperial rule that can mutually can recognize, still there is a true papal power at the time of, in temporal terms, at the time of Philip IV, that, in case you didn't notice, was not a Holy Roman Emperor either, even though he used the same identical terminology of Caesar and Emperor. It was traditionally attributed probably to Holy Roman Emperors, and admittedly, there was nothing strange, and especially at that point in French tradition and power, given that it was basically and truly like an imperial one in scale and purpose, and had surpassed Germany. There were still two temporal as well as spiritual powers at the same time. Philip IV of France as sacred ruler, probably saint blood as well in tradition, like having the blood of kings that won in battle the lordship over Europe. Look at Bouvines, where Philip II literally officiated the mass himself. And this was guaranteed by sacred royal authority, also by the local clergy, right? And fighting, in that case, a holy struggle against an excommunicated emperor, not properly a crusade, but still something that was seen indeed as holy war even before crusades happened to begin with. And at the time of Boniface VIII, again, the church had properly its papal states, it had its own armies, it had its own retinues and soldiers and in proper wealth that meant definitely something, if anything, in terms of spiritual capacity to hegemonize Western Europe, being uniformly recognized as the church. well after, in fact, also Crusaders had conquered Constantinople, even though had lost it again. I mean, showing what that prorompent Western power really was, essentially in a composite nature. It's obvious that if you split the church from the state, as it had happened by the establishment of Christianity, and attemptedly the things were sort of crammed together, like, for example, in the Byzantine case, but they were actually always separated in there, you're going to have this kind of temporal reflection on art. So a papal request there was not sort of different from an imperial request of absolute power and submission of the papacy that was also fully never achieved by anyone in their Christian history. And so, again, standards, regardless of what both sides claimed, what was their effective power? There you have the answer. The answer is in history. Right. So this ideology, I think, is quite fascinating, because nowadays you have a tendency of quote-unquote traditionalists. And I say quote-unquote because, again, we make history of tradition here, but very often these aspects are underrated. Let's say the archetypal sense the church is the woman and the emperor is the man is merely institutional. It doesn't fundamentally absolutize the archetype in the in the actual earthly administration, in instantiation, given in fact the limits of both. Right, there is actually a feminine element in some emperor was less powerful, and feminine in a church where there were some popes that were, quite a massive display of virtus, and so virility in terms of actual imperium wielded, right? You can't say to an Innocent III that is a feminine power, right? He's old. It's something much different. And in any case, these elements are meant to be complementary, fully integrated, not merely competitive with one another. They must be, if, like at this point in history, Western civilization is incredibly powerful. This had been present also in the Roman Empire. You could have never had the Roman Empire if patricians and plebeians had not had their beefs back in the day and been able to fully integrate each other with still a competitive mechanism, but that, in that sense, allowed this massive power to be unleashed from the wall, right? So there is a deep misunderstanding of the participation. Imagine, again, you look at the Augustan Empire and said, but since there were some plebeians who held imperial offices, so this was not the golden age. It doesn't mean anything. This was an integrated hierarchy of different elements that made the wall successful. Equally, this was the case during the Middle Ages. Therefore, let's be careful to distinguish too categorically between Ghibelline and so-called Guelphic movements. If anything, because, as you know, the same terms are very contingent and somehow adapted also from the original meaning. This is basically the Italianate version of essentially battle cries between the Hohenstaufen house and the one of Welfen in northern Germany that, yes, like still had obviously different alignment with the papacy, but they weren't quite simply, hostile or supportive of the papacy just per se, right? And there was actually a great effort of cooperation. We don't have to descend here in German politics. We know obviously that as long as an emperor was excommunicated, German princes sided with the papacy, so to say, to usurp his land, unless they were faithful. The same Hohenstaufen had risen in that sense as the only ones who had not defected from the Salians, the time of Henry IV. But in this sense, what is Guelph, right? There is hardly a doctrine expressed in a Guelphic sense. The Ghibellines are, in this sense, more traditional and imperial, but the same Guelph knights, so to say, and think about the Guelph front that is essentially Capetian, Angevin in nature. We're talking about some of the top monarchic and chivalric and knightly rulers. Doesn't matter how bent to devotion for the church, and in that sense aligning to a specifically international situation where they were posited against the reemergence of a German empire. But as we've just said, like Philip the Fair was literally, this is ironic because they were technically still allies while the French sacked the papal palace at Anagni, so that you could have, you see, in a truly Catholic, ecumenic sense, like the same internal struggles without the outer face of the relation between the papacy, in that sense, the King of France proclaiming himself a Caesar, be touched by it, right? So this is interesting as far as what is opened in later times. We'll talk now better about who did what in that sense of sort of supporting the church or not. But when we look, for example, at the faction in Italian politics supporting the papacy against imperial claims in the communal era, right, the Lombard League. First of all, we've seen in many videos that this had been born out of a consular, that is, knightly military class. And that was often, in fact, struggling and wrestling power from the same emperor by claiming imperial authority on their own. This is often underestimated of the Lombards and how they saw their own power as knights and as an establishment of the same. So, regardless of this naming after the wealthy family of German dukes and rooted in earlier investiture controversy in the 11th, 12th centuries over the right to appoint bishops and abbots that pitted popes like Gregory VII against emperors like Henry IV, we're not actually trying to sort of annihilate the primordial solar unity of the two powers. So with a moon that properly receives light from the sun, if we want to use this metaphor, and in fact did not either express any specifically sort of motherly vibing, right? So some meridional principle in an attempt to return to a gynecocratic vision. The more you look at the same wealth war, the more you realize maybe modernization, secularization, that was happening because those were also the most powerful places in Europe, telling the truth at that point, and powerful militarily, right? You could, if this was kind of a female-based principle, like who did stand successfully against the imperial cavalry charges, right? And defeat the emperor in the same wars of the Lombard League. This doesn't make much sense. You can't see it as some chthonic force that sort of compared to the ideal of the solar principle. But in practice, as we said before, it's more like powers counterbalancing one another. And actually, one element that speaks of Romano-Germanic adherence to originary liberty and freedom of citizens in arms is actually these movements as such. The fact that first of all, the empire and even feudalism did not actually succeed, or even probably within the most feudal countries like France, to stifle communal development. To a degree, it happens, admittedly, especially in probably feudal kingdoms. But while in the Byzantine Empire you have an asphyctic urban development in communal autonomy, like in the West, this goes in parallel with the development of a feudal and chivalric and, in the sense, universal civilization. The communes are not an antithetic element in an imperial context. They are a constitutive part of an incredibly strong, healthy, and powerful body that, in fact, achieves some imperial feats. These guys went to war with imperial eagle symbolism. This is admittedly also the point. Like, the same communal world was not just split between Guelphs and Ghibellines, but at large, like conquest. Sort of, if you look at heraldry, like the entire lifestyle, the entire idea that the greatest ambition of the commune was to lord and tower over the others by affirming themselves into combat and holy combat with their own saint protectors, with this sort of obvious knightly nobiliar dominance on the field and so on, is quite there, and it's actually sort of mirroring great part of what even we see for example, with a great contribution of the plebs in the same Roman times. At the time, the Camillian reforms extends, in fact, the aforementioned imperial faculty to plebeian members, to essentially unlock them and go into war with unprecedented level of power in conquering the world. So what we see in the Middle Ages is, let's say, from one side, unfortunately, a much less unitary picture, but in this sense also, if you are able to travalicate the namely political fragmentation of the world, you actually see that, again, the West is pretty darn cohesive. The entire Western Eurasia and North Africa revolve around it as the big, by far the biggest civilization. There is nothing that really can compare in that regard, and it's impossible not to see how much of a Roman Empire reborn the whole scale of European power is during the Middle Ages. And this is a perspective that admittedly so many people do not imagine. It's not like they are not perhaps willing to believe, but of course, if you have been repeated over and over again that the Middle Ages were dysfunctional, underdeveloped, that antiquity was better, there isn't much, especially also from a strictly material demographic point to actually argue that. What was different was the form, and in this sense, the adherence to some higher moral, spiritual principle that in the Middle Ages is surely more fraught with division and these issues that surely stemmed from an anti-primordial solar unity problem, but because humanity had collapsed in the meanwhile, and also as a consequence of the exhaustion of the Roman Empire, right? So when you look, however, at the Church adopting the symbol of the Mother through the Marian devotion and ecclesiology, that's victory, right? That's the same symbolism you find in Artemis that stands, that is over the moon, right, as the transfigure, in fact, illuminating female principle, that Artemis is an Olympian, right? It's not a Hera, it's not a Juno. That's not what Mary symbolizes. It's the Sophia Perennis, as a matter of fact. And so it's a bit difficult to make the case that the Church would be some sort of strange great mother of, pre-Indo-European Pelagian times that divorce her own children. So there is an archetypal principle of, again, in the institution itself, you can say what the emperors eventually fail against this force, but they also fail because this archetype was blurred in the actual temporal instantiation of these powers. And so the Church was not sort of communistically, feministically pursuing any disintegration of traditional virility, right? And if there was an element within it that was sort of bringing to it, that existed in the broader world, in the broader society, to the extent this was not a unitary divine empire. But the empire still existed, and paradoxically, the peak of the empire is also at the peak of the clash with the Church, and the power of the Church. So this is very unique, and it shows that there is not an oppositive dichotomy, just like a Rome against Carthage. And even there, you could say, well, there surely was in Carthage a more godfather orientation with Baal, whatever. Yeah, but the temper, also the symbolism, frankly, was different. This was true also in the Middle Ages. But it wasn't true in the sense that they excluded one another. The empire recognized the Church, and the Church recognized the empire. Again, there weren't emperors, but those crowned as such by the Church and elected by the Roman people. It was all one. You hardly had that in a clash between Rome and Carthage. It was much more vital. So when you look at the vestiges of classical antiquity and you reflect on the meaning of this apparent dichotomies, you just realize that there is something very different in the Middle Ages. Something that had paradoxically been salvaged in terms of formal form, so to say, whereas in antiquity, in fact, the Pelagian element was yet to be fully tamed, whereas in Europe, you can argue that until communism took over in certain places, like there wasn't such a thing, there wasn't such a attempt to deny traditional power in European imperial ambitions and so on. And so this is something we will have to discuss at many different points, because certain aspects are counterintuitive. Catholicism, for example, always maintained much more strongly this full idea of empire, of theosis, of value of the works. It can't be mistaken for something else, right? And always remember, in the sense that in the idea of the emperor regarded by the church as her son, there is the same Indo-European theology of, indeed, the God being father, husband, and son of the mother, right? So of the great mother. So there's always a hierarchical integration in this. Today we didn't talk so much about, again, how gradually emperors lost that sort of Sebastocratic recognition. Could be found also among the Franks or the Saxons in relation with Rome, not as tribesmen per se, but also as they emerged to unprecedented levels, yes, but in the case of the Saxons it was already because the Franks had set the standard, and that had been set essentially as the Franks were already in Gaul, as Christianized, right? So the sun against the empire's moon is not much an against, but a reflection, right? A coexistence in two different moments of standards, natures, that are inextricably entwined. Penalty not sort of being able to save the world according to proper intent. So it's something that you want to appreciate in some more complete form, and I will come back on these topics because, in my opinion, they're very misrepresented, misconstrued, and fundamentally too complex in their real-world instantiation for sort of properly re-leading them to their archetypal meaning, right? So this seems like a much deeper, much deeper dynamic. And what can we say? This video had to be like 5 times longer. So I am now sort of taking things a bit more easily in terms of let's sit somewhere with this and let's argument how step by step this thing works, rather than simply shocking people with 20 things at a time. And let's reflect point by point on this stuff. It's probably for the next month or so we will really be addressing this aspect of the matter. All right, and then we will enter also a different world, so to say, when we will see more in depth the actual relations between Christendom, Charlemagne. And this video actually is aiming at showing, so this, we can consider this, I will not treat it as parts of a same episode. These are standalone ones, but the broader path we will go through this week, this month, will be fundamentally the one of the reactivation of the classical principles within the landscape that we've shown now, to actually reinforce the notion. Think about Romanesque Gothic art, or the same crowning of the rulers, of how the church always espoused, right, and the sort of lay power in so many different circumstances. And so we remember investor controversy, but we don't, because it's an exception. It's violent and so on, but it's also the exception compared to the norm of sort of cordial and cooperative, papal and imperial, in this sense, episcopal and comital relations that are the bedrock of essentially Western unity at this point. Because if this had turned into, a major theological issue, it would have been a continuous schism. Whereas Also, Latin Christendom displays a unity that is absolutely the envy in a broader spiritual and metaphysical sense of practically any other religion at the time. So it's, say church, again, religion is wrong as a term, and as we said before, Christianity carries the portentous concept of theosis, of incarnation, and of Trinity, right? Probably the theological instantiation of the metaphysical dimension through which you can reach divinity. And so this was encoded in the Roman Church, in Christian theology. If you don't actually see how this could be the only precondition also for an imperial election and the bestowal of that power as much as the elevation to further heights, it's a bit difficult to go anywhere with this topic. But again, we will see all these things better in other videos. I'm very glad that we are condensating enough content on these matters, because they tend to be very much followed and appreciated. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.